So like all of our bills keep going up. Gas, right, utilities, water, like everything. My rent went up $75 a month in January, food. And so then they take that $300 away.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's Family Economic Support Forum. My name is Dr. Gwendolyn Oglesby Odom, and I currently serve as the chair for Children's Advocates of Change. I would like to turn this over to our moderator for today, President and CEO of Children's Advocates for Change, Dr. Tasha Green-Cruzat.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Children's Advocates for Change Family Economic Support Forum. My name is Dr. Tasha Green-Cruzat, and I am the president and board member for Children's Advocates for Change, an independent, nonpartisan child advocacy organization committed to the well-being of every Illinois child, where we champion those policies and investments to ensure children are well-educated, healthy, and safe. Next slide. Next slide. So just a few points of information for housekeeping. Your microphone will be muted. Please place any questions in the Q&A box, and please feel free to make comments in that chat box. We want your engagement. We want your thoughts. So please feel free to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback following today's event. We want to thank our sponsors for this forum today. That's the Helen Maurice Weigel Fund. Next slide, please. Thank you. And Nicor Gas. Next slide. I want to give a warm welcome to our panelists today, but I just want to acknowledge that U.S. Representative Suzanne DelBene could not make it today. And so we are sorry that she will not be a part of this conversation, but we have our wonderful panel here today to carry on and hold up the conversation. I want to first introduce our senator here in Illinois Senator L.G. Sims, who represents the Illinois 17th State Senate District. He served in the Illinois House from 2012 to 2018, and in the Illinois Senate since then. He is currently chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and he is an attorney. And at one time, he served as the Senate Appropriations Director. Next, we have Dr. Valerie Wilson, who is a director of the Economic Policy Institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. Prior to joining EPI, she was an economist and vice president of research at the National Urban League Washington Bureau. She has written extensively on various issues impacting economic inequality in the United States. And then we have Dr. Weimer, who is a director of the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University School of Social Work. His work in part focuses on how families cope with poverty and economic insecurity, with a particular focus on how families manage food insecurity and other forms of material hardship. Before we start our panelists here, I want to invite Vice President of Public Policy for Children's Advocates for Change, Mitch Lipson, to provide an overview of the national child poverty rates and the impact the child tax credit has. So Mitch, I want you to go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Well, let's start by looking at the child poverty rates. There are two different ways to measure child poverty. There's what the Census Bureau defines as the official poverty measure, which looks at income before taxes and then is measured against an established poverty threshold, which in the case of a four-person household was $26,500 in 2021. However, the foundation of that poverty threshold is based on a formula first calculated in the 1960s that looked at the cost of a minimum food diet and then determining that it represented about a third of household expenditures at the time was multiplied by 3. It's been adjusted by inflation since then. Now, many people say that official poverty measure isn't reflective of a household's available resources, especially today. So the government developed a supplemental poverty measure that takes into account tax credits, the value of in-kind benefits such as housing subsidies, work expenses, child care expenses, and housing costs, among other items. As you can see, the result produces a variance and a sharp one in 2021 that is reflective of the additional assistance the federal government made available in COVID economic relief packages, which included a significant increase in the federal child tax credit. Next slide, please. Still, within the official poverty measure, there are stark differences by race and ethnicity in the child poverty rates. And while tax benefits and credits help mitigate the range of variance, the supplemental poverty measure still shows variance in rates. Next slide, please. Now, the official poverty rates are significantly influenced by household income. As you can see here, there are, by race and ethnicity, significant differences. Nationally, the non-Hispanic white household median family income is 2.2 times that of Black households. If you looked at the same demographic groups for Illinois, it's a ratio of 2.7. Next slide, please. The 2021 changes to the federal child tax credit not only increased the maximum credit value from $2,000 to $3,600 for children under the age of 6 and $3,000 for other children, but it also removed a requirement that a taxpayer have a minimum income of $2,500 and what was a phase-in to the full value of the refundable credit. That's what a taxpayer would receive if the calculated credit exceeded that taxpayer's income tax liability. That made the credit available to a new range of individuals previously not eligible. It also advanced half the credit value in monthly payments from July to December. But the changes Congress made were enacted for only 1 year, and an estimated 19 million individuals, including 671,000 Illinoisans, will not be able to take advantage of the full credit going forward unless Congress changes the law. Next slide, please. Just to emphasize the magnitude of the impact of the changes, combined with other COVID economic relief measures, the country's child poverty rate fell by almost half. Even with other COVID relief measures, without the child tax credit changes, child poverty would have been significantly higher in 2021. Next slide, please. So all of this comes at a time of high inflation. The November numbers released by the Labor Department this week are slightly better than October's, but inflation is still running at a high overall level of 7.1%, with food and energy prices even higher. Now, to help Illinois residents deal with inflation, the state passed an economic relief package earlier this year of nearly $2 billion. That included, among other measures, suspension of certain state sales taxes, property tax rebates of up to $300, and income tax rebates to qualified households of $50 for individual and $100 per dependent up to 3 children. All these were one-time measures, but it did increase the state's earned income tax credit from 18 to 20% of the federal EITC and widened the pool of eligible individuals. Regarding the income tax rebates for dependents, perhaps some would see that as a version of a state child tax credit, but it's not permanent. However, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 12 states had some version of a state child tax credit as of July 2022, which vary in their value, refundability, and qualifying age. But I think it's worth noting that 3 of the 12 enacted child tax credits this year. So with that, we'll turn to our panel for our discussion about potential next steps.
All right. Thank you so much, Mitch. Let's start with Dr. Weimer. Dr. Weimer, we took a quick look at some of the changes in the national child poverty rate with the expiration of the enhanced child tax credit benefit. But could you first discuss your center's findings on how families use the monthly payments of the child tax credit?
Yeah, absolutely. So study after study has come out on the child tax credit, both from our center and other researchers across the country. And the biggest single expense that people report spending the money on is food. And after that, there's a variety of expenditures that people are making with it. A lot of people are catching up on back expenses, back rent, paying for other essentials, paying for goods for the child, and a little bit of savings as well. So one of the interesting things, these are come from surveys where people say, what did you spend the money on? We actually did in-depth interviews with a number of people here in New York City, and actually talked to people multiple times across the 6 months that the payments were in effect, as well as after the payments disappeared. And one of the things that was really interesting is what people reported spending money on varied a lot month to month as well. So one family, for instance, spent the first payment primarily on food and rent, and then in September spent more of the payment on school supplies for the child. November spent more of the money on providing sort of a holiday during Thanksgiving period. And it was really impactful also when these payments went away as inflation was kind of soaring. So what that showed to us was also that these payments came in the form of cash, which has really disappeared from the safety net and from the budgets of a lot of low-income families. You have food stamps, which can be used for food, or housing subsidy, which can be used to reduce your rent payments. But the cash really allowed flexibility and what some people reported as sort of a bit of a room to breathe in their monthly budgets and their monthly portfolios. So.
Thank you. So Dr. Weimer, can you tell us how the credit enhancement addressed child poverty with respect to race equity?
Yeah, absolutely. So before the expansion to the child tax credit went into effect in 2021, we had done a number of studies here at the center, and others had as well. And one of the striking findings was just how many kids in the U.S. were left out of receiving the full federal credit under prior law. So we found nationally that was about 1/3 of kids. But when you look at specific groups, especially across race and ethnicity, you see that it was fully about half of Black and Latinx children who were left out of the full federal credit. And therefore, with the expansion, stood to gain the most in terms of narrowing some of those, pernicious gaps that Mitch pointed to in the presentation that started the panel. And so you saw, dramatic reductions in child poverty in 2021. So for the Census Bureau reported, a drop of 46%. And there were large drops in child poverty for Black children as well as Latinx children. Again, those gaps still exist and are still dramatic. So not as much narrowing as one might have hoped. And if the policy were in place longer, I think you'd see more reduction in those gaps, because there was a lot of efforts to make sure all the children, even the kids in families with the lowest earnings and lowest incomes, could get enrolled in the program and start receiving the payments. And there was progress made even over those 6 months in making that happen. Obviously over multiple years, 2-3 years, you would see a lot more progress on that. And I think that would lead to even more reduction in gaps by race and ethnicity.
Well, Dr. Weimer, some opponents of the provided enhancement argue that it was a disincentive for work. What evidence did you see where, in regards to employment, what did that evidence show?
Yeah, no, there was a lot of concern about it. And our research at the center finds that, it seems like some of that concern was pretty overblown. You know, there were some initial estimates put out by some economists that it would lead to this many reductions in employment or reductions in hours worked, et cetera. But those are based on, you know, studies of older programs and you know, what economists call elasticities of labor supply, et cetera. But what we did at the center and what others have done with other data sources is try to look at like, well, what happened in real life as these payments were being made. And so we had a study using national data and actually looked comparing families who received more versus less an increase in their child tax credits before and after the law, and really saw no evidence, no matter which way we cut it, that there was any reduction in work. The others have found the same thing in different populations. For example, there's one study recently on a sample of folks who were receiving SNAP, the food stamp program, similarly found no reductions in employment. We have a data set here in New York City where, you know, again, we didn't mostly found no results. If anything, we found a hint that maybe some folks were working a little bit more hours. And what was interesting about that is if you think about it, there's for some families, it might allow them to work a little bit less, you know, if they were working two jobs and they needed to provide more childcare or, you know, were being overworked, for example, they might be able to cut back a little. For another family, they might be able to work a little bit more. There are these sort of fixed costs to working like childcare and transportation, et cetera. So for some families, the payments can actually help promote work. But on net, we really saw no evidence that this was a major dampener to employment.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Weimer. Dr. Wilson, good afternoon. So for families, the household median income, and that does not include tax credit or in-kind benefits, represents income from the employment of parents and guardians. We saw the persistent gap in median household income, but doesn't your research show that whatever wage percentile or education level you examine, the gap in income between Black workers and white workers still persists?
Yes, it's important to note that when we're talking about money income, the vast majority of non-elderly households get about 73% of that income from working. Yet, there are large and persistent racial disparities in unemployment and earnings by race, ethnicity, and gender that are actually defining features of the US labor market. And so the main source of income is itself impacted and has unequal and disproportionate impacts on people. Just to cite a few statistics, I think most people are familiar with the 2-to-1 Black-white unemployment rate disparity. But it's also important to understand with that 2-to-1 disparity holds across multiple periods of economic expansion and recession. It's observed for all age cohorts. We see it at every level of education, and we see it for men and women alike. On the wage side of things, you know, there are a number of factors that we assume affect one's pay, typically things that, you know, would influence productivity, your experience, your education. Pay may vary based on where you live in the country because of differences in cost of living. But the fact is less than half of the observed disparity between the average hourly wage of Black workers and white workers can be accounted for by these factors, you know, things that reasonably might affect one's productivity. And so the earnings and employment disparities in the labor market and their effect on labor income absolutely has a disproportionate impact on workers of color and the economic well-being of those families.
Dr. Wilson, what steps can we take to reduce the gap, whether by means of the public or the private sector? What can we do?
So many of those disparities, labor market disparities that I cited, and the fact that they exist at every wage level, every level of education, basically every age cohort across gender, that points to the fact that there are larger structural factors at play that really go beyond an individual's ability to invest in education or to build skills as a way of addressing or narrowing that gap. And so policy becomes absolutely essential to closing that gap. and government, institutions, and businesses each can play a role in addressing those equitable outcomes. Policies geared towards maximizing employment and limiting the depth and duration of recessions are essential, like many of the policies that were implemented during the COVID-19 crisis. And it's also important that we use policy to make workers less vulnerable to limited job prospects and low wages, in particular for workers of color who tend to be disproportionately impacted by economic downturns. The other side of that is that excessive and premature fiscal austerity limits opportunities for growth. And it's important to prioritize investments that create good jobs in high unemployment and high poverty communities in order to promote racial equity. Labor unions also play an important role because they help to give workers a stronger collective voice to advocate for higher pay, better benefits, training and promotional opportunities, and can provide some protections against discrimination and harassment. And then finally, meaningful accountability for discrimination requires that we confront the power and information asymmetries between employers and employees that serve to weaken our enforcement system. And so encouraging employers to provide greater transparency in their hiring and promotion policies and how they set pay, and in funding the federal, state, and local enforcement agencies that are responsible for enforcing our anti-discrimination law.
Thank you. Dr. Wilson, the supplemental poverty measure, which unlike the census poverty number that looks mainly at earnings, takes into account not just tax credits and in-kind benefits, but also additional expenses, still shows a significant poverty gap for children when comparing Black and Hispanic households to whites. And that's 2.7% for non-Hispanic whites and 8.1% for Blacks. So that seems to suggest federal and state benefits are not fully creating equity. Is that how we have our programs structured?
So I think it's important to really put those numbers in context. So that, in particular, the 2021 supplemental poverty measure really reveals the extent to which various safety net programs mitigated the worst effects of that recession. And so the comparison to the official poverty rate, which, as we've already mentioned, only accounts for before tax cash income, is important to really sort of understand how much ground was made up there. The supplemental poverty measure rate is only about a third of the official poverty rate for both of those groups. The official poverty rate for Black children was about 27%, and the official poverty rate for non-Hispanic white children was about 8.8%. And so there's clearly a big difference between if we were to measure poverty based only on a family's cash income versus if we measured it based on these additional benefits and income supports that were made available. Some of the programs that had the greatest impact on poverty overall were Social Security, refundable tax credits, broadly speaking, but the child tax credit in particular kept 3 million children out of poverty. The economic impact are stimulus payments, and then also SNAP and school lunch also were major contributors to reducing the supplemental poverty measure. But in regards to your question, and are we designing these programs poorly to address equity? I think it's important to understand that those programs are not designed to create equity. They are designed to reduce economic hardship, and they're effective at doing that. Essentially, they address a symptom of inequity and not the root cause for why we see disproportionate rates of poverty by race in the first place. In order to do that, we really do need to address the structural and historical factors that created and continue to perpetuate these disparities, including many of the labor market disparities that I mentioned earlier.
So do you think increasing the federal minimum wage would be part of the solution?
So increasing federal minimum wage, yes, is part of the solution. First, for anybody who is paid minimum wage, just because the value of the federal minimum wage is at its lowest point in 66 years, because it does not keep pace with inflation. But also, again, in considering the historical context, it's important to note that one of the stated demands of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was to increase the minimum wage so that it provided people with a decent standard of living. And there's research that has been done on the impact of expansions of the minimum wage historically, so that it covered a larger percentage of workers that were initially excluded from being eligible for the minimum wage in the Wagner Act. So those minimum wage increases since the 1960s civil rights era significantly reduced Black-white earnings inequality and are responsible for about 20% of the overall reduction in that gap in later years. But again, I will go back to the point that, again, the minimum wage is a broad program, and it's going to have a disproportionate impact on Black workers, because Black workers are disproportionately in those lower wage jobs. In addition to raising the minimum wage, we also need to address the structural factors that create that imbalance, that funnel more Black workers into lower paid occupations to begin with.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. Senator Sims, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cruzat. How are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
I'm outstanding. I can't, it might be a little cold and dreary outside, but it's warm in here because we're talking about how to improve the lives of children. It's warm inside.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, the Illinois legislature this past year approved a $1.83 billion family relief plan that included a permanent expansion of the state's earned income tax credit, a 1-year suspension of the state's grocery tax, a 6-month freeze on the motor fuel tax, a one-time property tax rebate up to $300 per household, and income tax rebate checks to qualified households of $50 per individual and $100 per dependent, up to 3 children. So as we noted, the rate of inflation, while moderately slightly, remains high and low, and moderately income families continue to face financial pressures to meet household needs. Do you see a pathway for a fiscal year 24 state financial relief package that might include some form of a state child tax credit?
Well, first, thank you for the question. And let me back up for 1 second and thank the Children's Advocates for Change for putting on the forum and having this discussion, because I think it's really important that as we prepare for the new legislative session, we have these types of discussions. And that was really the foundation of the discussions we had as we put together the fiscal year 23 budget, as we recognized the challenges that families were facing, how could we then respond in real time to the unprecedented pressure and fiscal pressure and mental health pressures that individuals are feeling as we try to come out of a once in a lifetime pandemic, or once in a century pandemic. So we recognize that relief package, it helped, but it certainly did not curb all of the financial burdens that families were facing. That the 2021 child tax credit proved to be beneficial for families. It brought forth thousands of dollars to support and help thousands of children all across Illinois and thousands of families all across Illinois. And as you talked about that not only the property tax relief package, but the income tax relief package, over 90% of individual taxpayers and individual and joint taxpayers received tax relief from that package. And that didn't go to the wealthiest of the wealthy. And I want to go back for another second on a question that you asked to Dr. Weimer about the disincentive to work. And what we have found is this narrative that one of the easiest ways to try to derail policies like this is to create these false narratives. This narrative that somehow if we are supporting individuals where wealth gaps exist, where economic deserts exist, then we are somehow disincentivizing work. And that can be further from the truth. What we are seeing is we put this $1.8 billion back into Illinois taxpayers' hands. And what's happened? You are seeing tax receipts at the state level. They are growing. You are seeing our economy is thriving. The Commission on Governmental Accountability and Forecasting Accountability estimated that we're going to have to revise our revenue estimates for fiscal year 23 upwards because of the strength of our economy and because we made those fiscally sound decisions. So as we begin those discussions for fiscal 24, the families who are struggling, they will no doubt be in the forefront of my mind. And I know in the forefront of our caucus's mind and my colleagues and throughout the General Assembly, we will be having these discussions as we put together the budget for fiscal 24.
Thank you. And Senator Sims, given that in part due to the state's flat income tax rate, we have one of the most regressive tax systems in the country where low income households, more frequently African-American households, Hispanic and Latino, pay a higher share of their income in state and local taxes than higher income households. So do you think a child tax credit could help build greater progress and equity into the state's tax system?
I absolutely believe that we need to look and use, and I've often said this, our revenue code has to be a reflection of our priorities and our moral responsibility to make sure that we are investing in communities, we are investing in families. One of the things I'm most proud of that we've done in previous General Assemblies and previous sessions is provide some of that short-term relief. Now, we also, as you mentioned at the outset, provided that long-term assistance with our permanent increase in the earned income tax credit. We still have a long way to go, but I believe that was a good first step. And that's why I say, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, it's necessary for us to fight these false narratives that when we provide assistance, it somehow disincentivizes work. What you've heard from Dr. Wilson and Dr. Weimer is that when you have these investments in closing wealth gaps, you will see families do better. You see individuals be lifted out of poverty. And that's what we are working towards. And that's what our focus is and should be, making sure that we don't leave anyone out of the economic benefits of a growing economy. And our current tax code does that. Now, I often tell a story that, and you mentioned it as part of your question, the regressivity of our tax code. It is fundamentally unfair that someone who makes $3,000 pays the same rate of tax as someone who makes $3 million. That just does not make sense. It would make more sense for us to invest in an individual who is making the $3,000 or $30,000. We give them opportunities and pathways to a brighter future and have a more progressive and more equitable tax code. We would have a tax code that doesn't punish the poor, but incentivizes growth. And I think that's where, as we continue to have these discussions, I think you'll see that happening, where we are continuing to see how our tax code can be used to provide support and to close wealth gaps between those who are looking for a pathway towards that brighter future I just mentioned.
So, Senator Sims, the state's Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, while revising the fiscal year's 2023 revenues upward, is taking a relatively conservative outlook for future revenues, not knowing what inflation will mean next year for the state's economy. Yet, given the issues of equity, right? I noted it is time for the state to re-examine the sales tax on services, with Illinois taxing relatively few services, particularly luxury services.
Well, I think, again, one of the things we've tried to do as we crafted the fiscal 23 budget, and even as we begin work on the fiscal 24 budget, is looking at ways to close those structural deficits which exist in our budget. What you saw as part of fiscal 22, but also fiscal 23 and leading over into fiscal 24 is us making some fiscally responsible decisions, making more investments into our state's rainy day fund, we put over $1 billion in our rainy day fund. We put over nearly $1 billion into our state's pension fund. So making those fiscally responsible decisions that will address those structural issues that hamper our budget and hamper our ability to grow, but will also save taxpayers millions of dollars in interest costs over the long term. And those millions of dollars that can be saved would be able to be put back into those types of activities that will grow our economy, that will invest in communities, that will make sure that we have individuals who are invested in when they're young, and invested in when they're going to school, and invested in when they're in their more vulnerable years as they grow older. But that's having that discussion of how we then invest and utilize our budget as a moral document, our tax code and our revenue code as a statement of our priorities. And our priorities are investing in working families. And I think as you continue to see the discussion we'll have over as we craft the fiscal year 24 budget, I think you'll continue to see that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Sims. So I'm going to open up some questions here for the entire panel. So please feel free to answer should this impact you in any kind of way. And I'm going to also invite Vice President of Public Policy for Children's Advocates for Change, Mitch Lifson, back to the conversation here because he gave a very comprehensive overview of poverty. So the Census Bureau notes that in 2021, income inequality began to grow again, and the Pew Research Center, using census data, has documented the growth in income inequality since 1970. So as we discuss assistance to low and moderate income families, what role does the issue of income inequality play? And what are your thoughts regarding the best way the public and private sectors can address it?
I'll jump in here, and I'm going to go back to the point that I was making with regards to the importance of how our labor market functions. Because again, when we're talking about low and moderate income households, few of them are independently wealthy or have inheritances. So they're getting money by working, by engaging with the labor market. I think one of the things that is not reflected in looking at the Census Bureau's graphics related to income inequality is thinking about nationally, what does the income distribution look like? And what share of our national income goes to labor or goes to workers compared to capital or the owners of capital. And I think that really underlies this larger disparity in income inequality. One of the things that we do at EPI is track the growth in productivity relative to the typical worker's wages or the median wage. And in fact, leading up to much of the post-war period up to about the mid-1970s, productivity and workers' wages grew at roughly the same rate, which meant that workers were getting a significant share of the income that they were generating as workers. In the mid-1970s, that's when we started to see this growing gap where productivity continued to increase. So we are producing more income nationally, but a larger share of that is going to workers. So I think an important part of this discussion is really thinking about how we give workers more bargaining power. And that is what really enables them to get a larger share of the economic profits, the economic benefits that they generate as workers in this country.
Thank you. The National Center for Children in Poverty once posed this question that I'll put before all of you. And that is, why should Americans care about family economic hardship?
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. We've talked about the census numbers and the sort of remarkable child poverty reduction that we saw in 2021, driven by things like the child tax credit. And that's really important. What it misses out on is some of the longer term consequences of investments in children. And I think there was a bit of a slide on that in the PowerPoint as well. But at the center here at Columbia, we recently completed a comprehensive benefit cost analysis of a child allowance federally, and then we've been able to do it in different states as well. And what we see is that it's an incredibly good investment when we give families the economic means to avoid hardship and invest in their children. So we look at the highest quality long-term studies of kids' outcomes, and there's a good, solid, large handful now that really show that how much a difference income makes in childhood. And the benefit cost ratio is over 7 to 8 to 1 in terms of the long-term monetary benefits versus the costs. And those come in children's completed education, their future earnings, their health, and even longevity and reduced mortality. And all these things add up and pave the way for a stronger society in the future. And so, when we think about these investments, we tend to think of the short-term, budget implications, the short-term poverty implications, all of which are important, but I think it's important to keep those long-term outcomes in mind as well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Weimer. So NPR reporter Greg Wazowski has stated this: our welfare system has long spent generously on the old, but it has consistently skimped on the young. So do you think that this is true? And if so, what is needed to change the mindset of the public and our elected officials?
I guess I'll take that one.
Okay.
I'm very proud of some of the work that we have done here in Illinois to prioritize our young people. We've invested millions in early childhood and child care services and a high quality education, both at lower and higher education levels. But as you just mentioned, there are numerous studies that there's a direct correlation between childhood economic struggles and mental health struggles as one gets older and moves into adult years. Frederick Douglass once said that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I think we have, and that's why I've talked earlier about dispelling those false narratives about what investing in services and investing in activities like this, they pay a dividend. And that dividend is no different than any other investment. The dividend may not pay off and it may not show up in the short term, but it absolutely shows up in the long term. And I think as we have to have a discussion, and one of the things that I'm very proud of the work that we have done in Illinois to talk about how these are investments, these are long-term investments to turn around communities, and not just an activity or not just short-term activities that cost money, but they are there to erase these wealth disparities that we have been talking about all day, and to close the wage gaps, and to create and eliminate and eradicate wealth deserts. So these have to be seen as investments, not just merely merely throwing good money after bad, but investments take time. And that's why, again, I'm very proud of what the mindset we have taken in Illinois to make those investments and to continue to invest in these resources, in these activities, because they will pay dividends. Because when you have a healthier child, you have a healthier adult.
Thank you, Senator. Dr. Weimer, along with the staff at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, you recently worked on a report regarding a 50-state analysis of child tax credit. Can you talk about the key findings, and in particular, what would make a state child tax credit most effective?
Yeah, absolutely. We just released this report, maybe about a month ago. And we do three things in the report. We try to, knowing that child tax credits at the state level are going to be sort of an area of innovation, we think, over the next decade, and really build on and capitalize on the success of the experiment with the federal child tax credit. We asked the question of what would it take for every state to achieve a specific child poverty target reduction. So we look at a 25% child poverty reduction as well as a 50% child poverty reduction, or cutting child poverty in half. And there are states that are considering this as we speak. As we wrote the report, we tallied up 10 state child tax credits. I guess it's 12 now, so it's growing. As this is a focus of public policy. So in Illinois, for example, I pulled those numbers, before the panel today. To reduce child poverty by a quarter, by 25%, would take a $1,400 per child child tax credit, and $3,300 per child to do that more ambitious cut child poverty in half number. So these are possible. It does take revenue, as the discussion on income inequality, I think, suggested. The money's there, right? There's a lot of revenue that could be used to invest in our children, as Senator Sims said. And then the third thing we do in this report, which I think is really important, it's less of a number crunching kind of thing, is we lay out the principles of how these credits can be designed such that they'll maximize that anti-poverty impact and improve that investment in kids. And so I won't go over all of them. We have 7 of them, but one of the keys is the full refundability, making sure that this goes to all kids, regardless of their family's economic circumstances or income. Making these benefits per child so that they don't tap out at the second child or the third child. All children are worthy of investment, and cost. There's cost to raising children. Underappreciated one is indexing to inflation. That's a very sort of policy wonky one, but as the inflation numbers that we've seen over the past year or two have really taken off, if those benefits are not tied to inflation and don't keep pace with inflation, then their anti-poverty impact really erodes over time. We're also big fans of the monthly payments that happened, and that's not always possible. It's more administratively complex, but we've shown in some of our research that it really reduces that volatility in income. When we talk about these poverty numbers, it's the total annual income over the course of a year, but families really experience a lot of volatility month to month in that, and those monthly payments can really help in that respect. And the last one I'll mention, I guess, is inclusivity. So there's the more you're including all kids in these benefits, the bigger the anti-poverty impact you're going to have. A big area there is the status of immigrant children, or children of immigrant families, who are sometimes excluded from some of these public programs and public policies, and that greater level of inclusivity is important for the overall outcomes of the policy.
Mitch, we talked about the impact nationally. Any idea of how many Illinois children benefited? And if you can also tell us how many Illinois children are in poverty?
So according to the IRS, the advanced child tax payments totaled around 1.4 as far as number of payments, and that benefited just over 2.3 million children. Now, to put that in perspective, there's just under 2.8 million children in the state of Illinois. So the payments did have an impact. One gauge using the supplemental poverty measure, the Census Bureau also releases data in 3-year chunks. And so if you looked at the number of kids determined to be in poverty in Illinois by that measurement from 2018 to 2020, and then compared it to the next group, 2019 to 2021, which would include the economic relief provided by the federal government and the state, there was a change of 85,000 children. So 85,000 fewer children were determined not to be in poverty. So there's no doubt that it had an impact. There's also no doubt that there's still a long way to go, right? As you were asking, the official poverty measure is around 16% for Illinois children in poverty. But again, we have these differences. For white children, it's around 9.1%, but for African-American children, it's above 35%. And in the video that led up to the start of this program, we were noting that many researchers really say you need about 200% of the federal poverty level really to meet household expenses. And by that gauge for Illinois children, 61% of African-American children are below 200% of the federal poverty level. And in total, about a third of the children in the state are below 200% of the federal poverty level. So that just, I think, demonstrates that there is a wide universe of individuals, and particularly disparities within that, of people who are just trying to get enough money to get by and meet household expenses.
Thanks. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the participants, and thank you. And I want to encourage you. We do have about 6 minutes or so left to wrap up. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And so we're going to first go to Ann Porter's question. Thank you, Ann. Her question is, if you were to craft a state budget that maximized child health and education, how would you balance targeted benefits from for low income families, like the refundable child tax credit, against broader tax breaks like property tax refunds, gas tax reductions, etc., that higher income families also benefit from? And the second part of this question, do the latter tax breaks boost economic growth for child tax credits and eventually allow more state revenues and more state spending on investments?
I think certainly you have to balance all of those competing interests, because at the end of the day, you're looking at, and that's why I mentioned looking at the revenue code as an investment tool. So you have to, and that's, as you're balancing all of those competing interests, that's how you look at, and we have to look at the revenue code differently. I think we have oftentimes looked at our revenue code with this short-sighted, very narrow view, as opposed to using and looking at the revenue code as a means to invest in communities. And I think that for our purposes, as we craft that budget, it makes sense to have that more broad view of how our revenue code can be used in a 2022 economy when we have a 1970s revenue code. That's, as we craft the budget, I think you have to look at and compete, use those and balance those competing interests, but also look with an eye towards the future and how we are going to grow our economy and make sure everyone benefits.
I'll just, to the second half of Ann's question, just point out that there is a multiplier effect for individuals and families that receive not only the child tax credit, but the earned income tax credit. It may vary by entity as to what the amount is. There was a Congressional Joint Economic Committee that used 1.25 as the multiplier for the child tax credit. So not only are there the long-term benefits that Dr. Weimer was talking about in health and education and income earnings, but the money is being spent in the economy and will be generating more tax revenue for the state.
And Mitch, I think that's a great point. As I talked about, as we looked at the family relief plan that Illinois passed, the impact, you can't understate the impact that those investments have made into our economy. Because lower income individuals, they also have, it's also shown that they have the lowest savings rates. So it's one of the reasons we have got to encourage these investments, because we know they're going to have that multiplier effect. And I think that's why we have to have a better and broader view of what our revenue code looks like.
We have another question from the participants here. And this question is from Tiffany Ellison. Thank you. What are some ideas about how we would fund an expanded child tax credit federally?
I think one of the main points or cases that is constantly made about how we fund more of these things that are important and we need is simply by getting wealthier people and corporations in this country to pay their fair share of taxes. There are a number of ways people have proposed to do that, but I think that's largely the question and the issue that's on the table. We were talking about income inequality earlier, and the fact that a larger share of income is going to really a much smaller percentage of our population. So recalibrating that balance and getting wealthier Americans and corporations to pay their fair share of taxes gives us lots of room to invest in these kinds of things that are in fact investments in the future of this country.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. We have a question from John Gordon, and his question is, does anyone on the panel have insight into how housing availability plays a role in reducing child poverty?
So the supplemental poverty measure, which we've talked about a number of times, lets you quantify the impact of various policies and programs on the poverty rate. We've talked a lot about the child tax credit. A smaller degree of poverty reduction is achieved through programs that help make housing more affordable. So housing vouchers, public housing units, et cetera. But when you actually look at the anti-poverty impact for those that actually receive help with housing, it's quite large, larger often than food stamps or some of these tax credits. It's just the fact that affordable housing and help with affordable housing is so rationed, and so few people get it. So there's these very long waiting lists to get assistance with it. There's also housing assistance, of course, through the tax code, through mortgage interest deductions, et cetera, and others have proposed ways that could deliver more assistance with affording housing through the tax code, potentially through things like renters credits, for example, in order to provide more balance between how we help homeowners versus renters. So it's quite important, I think, for poverty reduction.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and I think it's an appropriate one here, just to maybe piggyback off of the question prior. And this question says from Alec Lopata, thank you. Renters are more likely to be low income and need additional support. Can you envision a renter's tax credit as a way to support low and moderate income families in the coming years?
We didn't plant it with Alec, but Children's Advocates for Change this session did introduce, actually Representative Zaleski introduced it after we conferred with him, a bill for a renter's credit. It did not pass, but the premise in part is homeowners are allowed to take up to a certain income level, are allowed to take 5% of their property tax bill off their income tax in a given year. Renters don't get any such relief. So there are, I believe the last time I looked, some 20 states that have some form of a renter's credit. It does, again, vary by construction, depending on the state, whether it applies to people of all age ranges or a particular age range, such as seniors. But we think it has a lot of value, and we're looking to have it reintroduced in this upcoming legislative session, and hopefully it'll gain some traction.
Senator Sims, I think you were going to chime in.
No, Mitch actually stole my thunder. I was gonna mention the Zalewski bill, but also, Dr. Cruz, that you mentioned some of the work that I did as a staff director, and this was an area where we pushed this topic. We pushed this topic in budgets for a long time. I think it is an idea whose time has come, and I'm looking forward to having more discussions about it. Because again, I think we have to look at our revenue code as a tool and how to lift people out of poverty. So I'm certainly looking forward to having those discussions.
Well, we are out of time, and I feel so terrible because has been a great discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists, Senator L.G. Sims, Dr. Valerie Wilson, Dr. Christopher Weimer, and Mitch Lifson. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time. This has been wonderful, and we will definitely have a part 2 in 2023 to this conversation. And so if you want to contact us, I'm going to ask that that last slide be put up for information. If you're interested in reaching out to Children's Advocates for Change, please feel free to contact us at info@children'sadvocates.org. CAFC.org. Happy holidays to all of you, and thank you so much to our participants as well for joining us today.